NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
I'm going to give a brief overview of how we see law enforcement agencies use the technology. Very quickly couch it in terms of where does the algorithm itself fall in a sequence of different events that constitute the search that they run, and then pass it over to Josh to talk about the technology, and Kaitlin to talk about how it manifests in cases and what you can do. So what is face recognition technology? What are we talking about here? Very, very, very simply, it's an automated process by which you compare a photo of an unknown individual to a database of known individuals. In law enforcement, so the photo of an unknown individual is generally called the probe photo. Where do probe photos come from? Think of where a face shows up on camera. That can be a probe photo. Database photos are generally mugshot databases in a law enforcement context. They don't have to be, though. In New York, for example, they also are desk appearance tickets, pistol license applications. In 31 jurisdictions, at least, these also include driver's license photos. Over 50% of all American adults are in a face recognition system that's accessible to law enforcement thanks to getting a driver's license. This is a map that just shows that information, with the darker colors being where FBI can actually access those driver's license photos as well. So your client does not have to have a prior conviction or a prior arrest on the books to be in a face recognition database that is searchable by law enforcement. How do police use this technology? It's an investigative lead. So far, to date, we have not seen law enforcement agencies claim that this is a source of positive identification. So this, for example, is the NYPD policy around how they can use face recognition search results. They say pretty clearly in the policy, this is an investigative lead. It needs to be corroborated by further evidence prior to an adverse action taken against an individual. What does this mean in practice? It means very, very little. There is no guidance provided to officers about what constitutes sufficient corroboration of an investigative lead generated by a face recognition system. So as a consequence, what we see is very, very little corroboration. We see I-cards in New York, for example, issued solely on the basis of an investigative lead, which means someone's apprehended and put in a lineup. It's the witness ID that makes it into court, but that person is in the lineup the only reason the person's in the lineup is because of the face recognition possible match. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is the current state of play. It's not going to be the state of play in maybe 2 years. The FBI has stated publicly that they are looking to get face recognition classified as a positive identification and a lights out identification, meaning an individual would not need to review what the algorithm spit out as a match prior to it being considered a positive ID that they could introduce in court. They know that they're going to have to go through a Dauber or Fry motion or hearing before getting this classification. So as a consequence, they are mobilizing their experts and their papers to make this claim, to say this is a positive ID. What does this look like on the ground? There are 4 general categories that face recognition as currently used by police fall into. The first is stop and identify. This is in a handful of jurisdictions, Michigan, San Diego, I think Pennsylvania, jurisdictions in Florida, where law enforcement officers have face recognition on their phones. If they stop somebody in the field and that person does not produce identification, or for whatever reason they believe the identification is fraudulent, they can take that individual's photo and run it against their database. And they will get a match or a possible match in the field in a matter of seconds on their phone. Arrest and identify. In every jurisdiction that has a mugshot, a face recognition database that runs on mugshots, upon arrest of an individual, that face will be run against the existing face database and then also enrolled in that database, which means every single arrest will have a face recognition search as part of that. Similar to fingerprints. They take fingerprints, run those through the existing AFIS system. They take the face print, if you will, run that through the existing face system. One thing to note here, most jurisdictions, these face recognition databases are arrest databases. They are not conviction databases, which means someone may never have been charged or had the charges dropped, and they may still be in these databases for as long as that photo exists. Investigate and identify. This is the most common use of the technology by law enforcement today, where law enforcement has a face photograph from, name a source where a face photograph shows up, social media, ATM camera, body camera, CCTV camera. They run that against, they take that static image and run that against their existing database to discern who that person is. And then face surveillance. This is what we consider, this is what we call real-time face recognition. So face recognition running off of live video feeds in an attempt to identify certain individuals enrolled in a database by comparing those against every single face that walks by a given camera that has the software connected to it. This sounds like a horrible, I don't know, future dystopia reality. It's a current reality. The Orlando Police Department is trialing this with using Amazon's recognition software. Just yesterday or the day before, DHS announced that they are going to be trialing face surveillance technology around the White House to see if they can do a sort of pre-check against everybody walking around that area to see if anybody who raises suspicion shows up on their radar. So before I turn it over, I want to go through very briefly what I view to be 5 distinct components of a search, and I break it down like this because I think each one has its own very, very concerning due process questions that I'm not going to go too in-depth into, but when you're looking at face recognition in your case, to think about these different steps as raising discrete issues, any or all of which may be present. First is photo capture. Where are the probe photos coming from? And what is the quality of that photo? Does that photo have enough evidence in it to allow the algorithm to make a good identification? Either of these photos can be submitted to a face recognition system. Yes, one of them is not a photo, it's an artist's sketch of D.B. Cooper. There are no minimum quality standards when it comes to what photos can be submitted to a face recognition system for search. And as a consequence, at least a half a dozen agencies do allow, if not encourage, their officers to submit artist sketches to their face recognition systems. The next is pre-search editing. You get a probe photo, it's maybe a little grainy, maybe the individual's turning away from the camera, that's going to throw off the algorithm. So as a consequence, actually no big deal, let's just edit the crap out of that photo to make it match most closely with what a mugshot photo or a DMV photo looks like. That may include 3D modeling to rotate the face to face forward so that it matches what a mugshot photo looks like. That's incredibly common. That also means that the evidence, the face might be, you might have 60% of the face in the original evidence, and you could get a 90% match in the corresponding, after the corresponding search is run, because they've actually fabricated the remaining part of the face that's missing from the original evidence. The NYPD talks at length, the former detective talks at length in an article that I can send around about other techniques they use, like graphically replacing closed eyes with a set of open eyes from another photo to yield more results. They do that with open mouths, they will graphically close those mouths, change facial hair, etc. I'm not going to talk about the automated search itself because that's Josh's job. The fourth stage is the human review. So you run the search. What is the analyst or officer looking at? He's looking at a candidate list. This is a very simplified version with the input photo or the probe photo at the top, and then the candidate list represented at the bottom. It's now an analyst's job to review these and decide whether there's a possible match in the candidate list. These candidate lists might be a couple hundred people long. In New York, for example, they put the candidate list at 250 people. Are there forensic face experts doing this job like you have in a fingerprint unit? Nope. There is no such thing as a forensic face expert. In fact, people are pretty bad at this job. Humans are notoriously bad at identifying people by their face if we don't know those people beforehand, and yet there's no minimum training requirements for somebody to actually perform this task. And then there is the corroboration, as I mentioned before. And as I mentioned before, what constitutes sufficient corroboration has never been defined. So as a consequence, what we see is very, very little corroboration, and what corroboration happens is so closely tied to the algorithmic search that it can't be considered independent. That was a lot of information, but I'm going to turn it over to Josh to talk about the technology.
So, hi everyone, I'm Joshua Kroll. I'm a honest-to-goodness card-carrying computer scientist, not the only non-lawyer on stage, I guess. And I'm here to talk to you about the technology behind face recognition, not so much so that you can go out and implement face recognition technology or go out and use it yourself, but so that you can understand when you're looking at it and looking at claims people make about it, and how it works and what its capabilities are and what it can and can't do. I think it's important when we use technology in a sensitive context like criminal justice that we understand its capabilities and its limitations. To start, though, I want to talk about a more general kind of technology, which is machine learning. So often we talk about face recognition systems as a type of artificial intelligence, which I would give a very broad definition of as anything a computer does, which we as humans would consider to be intelligent. And specifically, a lot of these systems are built using a particular kind of technology called machine learning. And machine learning works by taking data that we have, examples that we have of anything in the world that are labeled with something. So maybe in this case, it's pictures of your face or a bunch of people's faces labeled with their identities, their names. And then we will break that data into what in computer science we call training data and testing data. And then we feed that training data into some sort of machine learning algorithm, some sort of tool which is designed to extract patterns from it and find those patterns so that we can reuse them. And then we will test out the patterns that we found on the held out test data to make sure that we actually learned the thing we wanted to do. And then finally, out of that, we get some statistics that tell us roughly how well we did. And so we use this general paradigm to develop technology. In the case of face recognition, that paradigm is used not once, not to just turn pictures of faces into identities, but in a whole pipeline. And the interesting thing about this pipeline is that it has many stages, and that those stages go from identifying whether or not there's a face in an image, to aligning that face, to extracting features from that face, to finally matching it against a set of users that we often call the background set in this particular application. But what's interesting about these tasks is that they're all independent machine learning tasks, and they can fail independently. And if you fail on one of the earlier ones, like if you fail on detecting whether or not there's a face in an image, then you haven't detected a face in the image, and then your chances of recognizing what the face that you haven't detected are pretty small. And that's important because we want to know what these systems can and can't do, like I said. So humans look at pictures and we see faces all the time. We see patterns in everything. Machines, as it turns out, aren't so good at seeing patterns even when they're there. Machines just see sets of pixels, and that's all you have to work with, and you have to extract the patterns from those pixels. And so if we start at the beginning of the pipeline in face identification, I think there's a primer I wrote that has some specifics as to how this stage works, but it tends to work by way of passing some sort of filter over the image that looks at sort of the flow from light to dark, broadly speaking, generally in a black and white image. And you can see in the image on the left that face identification can fail. You can have what to a human is clearly a face in the image, but doesn't read to the machine as a face in the image because it's not facing forward, because it's not looking directly at the camera, because maybe it's not as well lit. And so that plays to some of these editing questions that Claire was talking about. Once you have identified a face, you probably crop it out and just feed into the rest of the pipeline a close crop of that face. Sometimes, as you can see in the lower right, that face is not perfectly aligned, and so maybe you'd want to automatically try to edit the image to make a more aligned version of the face. So the original image in that example is the one on the right, and then the edited one is the one on the left, showing that it kind of faces the camera more directly. The nose is in the middle. The eyes have been made symmetrically on either side of the nose, and that tells you something else that's happening at this stage, which is that often there's some sort of face geometry, standard face geometry that's applied to images to say that this is what faces look like. And we're going to modify the image to force them into this standard facial geometry. And so what you see in the left hand, the higher up set of images, is that this standard face model has been superimposed on an image, finding key points on the face that correspond to points of interest in the standard face model. Now, it's the case that a lot of modern systems tend to avoid this step or minimize the amount of transformation that's done at this step because this is an easy place to acquire failures. So if you fail at this stage, maybe you decide that someone's ear is actually an eye, and then you re-transform the face to put that ear in the place where you think the eye should go, and now you have just something that is completely wrong, and you have a catastrophic failure, and downstream you have no hope of ever getting the right answer. Once you've got a close crop of the face that you can feed in, typically you extract some features from it. If you asked humans to extract features from faces, people might talk about the separation of the eyes, or the length of the nose, or the size of the eyebrows, or the spatial relationship of these things, or the size of the ears, the color of the eyes. Computers tend to use features that are a little bit more abstract, and there are tools for sort of extracting the features that are most discriminative, that most separate faces from each other, that make it easiest for the computer to tell the faces that you've trained it with apart from each other. And that's important because it shows you that this stage, like the previous stages, relies on training that's based on some data that you've fed in. Once you have those features, you generally map them into some encoded form. Most typically in modern systems, you build what computer scientists would call a semantic embedding space, which is a fancy way of saying that you've taken the features and put them into some representation whereby, again, you've taken the faces that you have and sort of maximally separated them from each other so that you can tell what's what. And ideally in this space, the distance between features that you've extracted corresponds in some way to telling people apart. And so what you can see here is that the face on the left has been mapped into a set of features, and ultimately what's sometimes called a face print, which in this case is just a list of numbers. It might not be that many numbers. It might be like 100, 128 numbers is probably pretty normal. But that is a reduction of the face to a set of numbers, and the idea is if we've done this well, then sets of numbers that are somehow close to each other, that have small distance between each other, correspond to the same identity, and numbers that are very different each other probably correspond to different people. So that's the idea. And just to drive that home, we've taken things in a sort of an input space of photos that we understand, and we've put them into some representation space which is different abstractly, but allows us to draw a nice separation between them. And this graphical representation is maybe a little bit misleading because typically we would think of this mathematically as mapping things onto a sphere, but I will leave that aside. Once we've got some sort of embedding or face print that we've extracted from the photo, we have to turn that into an identity. And like I said a minute ago, we might do that by measuring the distance between the face prints. So we say that all face prints within a certain distance of each other correspond to one person's identity, or we might come up with some sort of classifier, some sort of way of function, formula that turns those face prints into identities somehow. And this is the one place in the face recognition pipeline where we're actually making use of the enrolled photos that we've collected from the people who are actually being probed against the database, who we actually care about. Prior to that, we could be using data to train on a completely different set of people. So I want to focus in on two areas of the face recognition process or evaluation process that I think are of importance to the people in this room. One is that question of training data that I just alluded to, and the other is how we think about confidence and accuracy and thresholds and the tunable parameters within these systems, because these systems do have sort of levers that you can pull that make them more and less accurate. And so if we go back to that pipeline and we look at it more closely, like I said, the last stage, the identification stage, is derived from the set of people for whom we actually have photos. So these would be your mugshots, your pistol licenses, your DMV photos. But all these previous phases are also independently trained as separate machine learning problems, and they might be trained on completely different data. And the reason that's important is that the people the people in those data sets may not represent the people that you're actually interested in probing against the database. And that's important because if you want the future not to look like the past, you shouldn't use machine learning. So machine learning is very good at taking patterns that it finds in existing data and applying those patterns. And if you move outside the patterns that the machine learning can identify, then you're not going to have the information you need to make the judgments you want to make. As I mentioned, each of these things is trained on a different set of data, that representation issue is important because we know that even the simpler tasks, like identifying whether there's a face in the image at all, fail differentially for different groups of people. So this is a picture of a colleague of mine by the name of Joy Bualamwini. She is at MIT. She did a PhD in computer science, and in the process of doing that, was working on an art project that involved face recognition, and she discovered that her code would not recognize her own face, but that if she put a white mask on, she was able to get the software to recognize her face, which she thought was problematic, so she did a study, and you can't really see it, but you can sort of get the gestalt of the study from this slide, which is that using 3 of the biggest commercial face recognition offerings from Microsoft, IBM, and a Chinese company called Face++, she pulled a data set of official portraits from parliaments in 3 African countries and 3 Northern European countries, where there was a lot of there was good gender balance in these 3 countries in their parliaments, and there was a lot of dispersion among the countries in terms of skin tone. And so if you apply these face recognition tools to the whole data set, you find that you identify about 90 to 95% of the faces. If you just apply the face recognition, if you separate that accuracy, that test, and you apply it separately to the men and to the women as they've identified themselves in the photos, you find that it performs about 10% worse for women than for men. If you grade people on a 6-point skin tone scale from dark to light, and you group people instead into dark-skinned and light-skinned, the 3 points on the scale for dark-skinned and 3 points for light-skinned, you find, again, about a 10% fall-off for dark-skinned people over light-skinned people. And when you look intersectionally, you find a 20 to 30-point drop-off for dark-skinned women over the highest scoring subgroup. And that's interesting because what it tells you is those errors that you're seeing in the aggregated group, that 5 to 10% error, is falling almost entirely on a particular subgroup. And you might hypothesize that that's because this face identification system was trained in a way that did not have enough say, dark-skinned women or dark-skinned people or women at all in the training data, and so it wasn't able to extrapolate and find those faces later on. Let's move on to talk about these tunable parameters, and let's focus in specifically on this matching and identification stage. When we do this, as I said, we might have done a good enough job of extracting the features and embedding them in some space that's meaningful, where we can just look at the distance between two sets of features. And we might ask, how do we know when something is close enough to be the same person as a test photo? And so we have a threshold. We say that, if it's within a certain distance from this test photo, then we will accept it as the same person. But that's not really telling us much of anything, because when we set that threshold, we haven't changed how far away anything is from anything else. It's a bit like if you take an exam at school and the professor curves the class, right? Setting the threshold for getting an A in the class does not make anyone's performance on the exam better. It does not improve how much anyone actually learned in the class or learned or expressed that learning by taking the exam. It only affects how many people get an A versus don't get an A. And so that threshold is not changing anything about the performance of the classifier. It's just changing how accepting we are of a match or not. Often these distances are also turned into confidence scores, so I think Clare used the phrase 90% match. I hope by this to convince you that these confidence scores are not real. They don't really represent probabilities. They're often represented as numbers from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100, but they don't represent the chance of anything. They don't represent the machine's confidence in a statistical sense. We often treat them as if they did, but they don't. They're just numbers that come out of the specific choices that were made in the development of a particular system at a particular time, and you might be able to compare them within that system, but maybe even not that. I'm going to skip over that because I talked about it already. And so when we move that threshold, if you think back to the exam, if we move the threshold for passing the class or not passing the class, what we do is we trade off the true positive rates, the false positive rates, the true negative rates, and the false negative rates, which means that we trade off the people who get good grades in the class, who actually learn things, versus people who get good grades in the class who didn't learn things, and then the other way around, people who fail the class despite having learned things, or people who fail the class sort of deservingly not having learned anything. So the takeaways that I want to leave you with before handing off to Kaitlin are that all the face recognition systems in the world are imperfect. They don't actually always get the right answer, and you shouldn't treat identification by a face recognition system as dispositive of anything. Similarly, the confidence scores are not meaningful. They're not probabilities. They don't tell you how confident the system is, and they might be misleading. They might take one of these face recognition analysts and convince them, hey, this face looks more like this person with a 60% score than this other person with a 90% score, but maybe I should match it to the 90% score because the machine seems to think that that's a better match. Similarly, if you cut off so if you're looking at 250 photos, that may be not such a problem. If you're looking at 3 photos or 5 photos, and the photo you want actually falls off the end because it didn't get a high enough confidence score, then that's problematic. And so when you're investigating a face recognition system, you want to know if it has been tested for accuracy and to what standards, and you also want to know if it was built using data that are representative of the population that you're actually measuring at all stages. You want to know that it captures the type of people that you want it to capture. So I will now hand it off to Kaitlin.
Hi, as Jumana said, my name's Kaitlin Jackson. I work at Bronx Defenders. And now that you've got sort of an idea of how facial recognition works, I want to talk about what you do in your cases whenever you pick up one of these. But before we start, one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is that the riddle of how we solve this, the argument that will eventually move some court, is something that, as far as I know, no defense attorney in any jurisdiction has solved. This is really an area where we can be incredibly creative. So I have a lot of ideas about what we should do, but I hope that you are all sort of keeping your thinking caps on and coming up with other new smart ideas that I would love to hear after this. So once the first difficulty to challenging facial recognition is finding out that you have a facial recognition case in the first place, which can be significantly harder than you might imagine. And that's because, as Claire described earlier, the way that this is typically working is that the police are taking a probe photo, and then they're doing their facial recognition thing, and they are coming back with a suspect. But they're not, right now at least, or should not be, going and making an arrest based on just that. What they're doing is going and finding some secondary piece of evidence to suggest that this suspect is really the guilty party. And then once they have that secondary piece of evidence, they're going to make an arrest. So once the case makes its way to you, and you're charging documents or arrest reports or whatever you get in your jurisdiction, it is incredibly likely that all that you're going to see is that secondary evidence. There may be no indication at all that your client was initially suspected because of facial recognition. So what do I mean by secondary evidence? What is that going to look like? Well, I believe that most often what that secondary piece of evidence is looking like is just an identification. So typically, I think what's going on is that the police are isolating a suspect, and then they're doing some sort of ID procedure, probably a photo ID most often, but maybe sometimes live lineups. So when you pick up the case, it is incredibly likely that what it'll look like to you is just any other ID procedure. So how do you figure out you have a facial recognition case? There's no real bulletproof way to do that, but I have a list of questions that I like to go through to decide if I think that the case I've got is a candidate. The first thing you want to think about is whether identity is at issue. If identity is not at issue, you don't have a facial recognition case. The second thing you want to think about is the witness who's going to sit on the stand and say that's the guy who did it, is that somebody that your client knows? Because if it is, you don't have a facial recognition issue. The only way you have a facial recognition issue is either if they're strangers or they're really not well known to each other. The third thing you want to be thinking about is whether there's a lag in time between the incident and the arrest. So as Claire said, it sounds like there are some police departments that are getting closer to real-time facial recognition, and while that is absolutely terrifying for a host of safety and privacy reasons, it really doesn't bring up the same concerns about misidentification that we're talking about here. If you have a facial recognition misidentification issue, there's a lag in time, because if nothing else, it's taking the police some time to go pull the surveillance or get the cell phone footage or whatever it is that they're building the probe photo out of and then sending back to the police department to get a match. And then the last thing that you want to be thinking about is, did this happen in a place, either was there photo or video surveillance, or did it happen in a place where it makes sense that there would be photo or video surveillance? If this happened in a basement and no one had a cell phone camera, you don't have a facial recognition issue. It is entirely, so if all four of those things happen, I think what you want to be doing right away is reaching out to the prosecutor and asking about facial recognition. It's entirely possible that all four of those things could be true and you don't have a facial recognition case. It's also possible that all four of those things might not be true and you still might have a facial recognition case. It's just less likely. But if you cannot figure out why your client was initially suspected, you really want to reach out to the prosecutor and start asking. And I think we have to recognize as defense attorneys, particularly if you practice in a jurisdiction like I do in New York with absolutely abysmal discovery laws, you really have to be the one to try to drill down and figure this out, because I don't think we can rely on the state to let us know when facial recognition is being used. And one thing I think you want to keep in mind is that when you're reaching out, if prosecutors are telling you, like they like to do, your client was suspected because there was surveillance or because a positive ID was made, that's really interesting information, but that's not getting at the heart of what you want to know, right? What you really want to know was, who watched that surveillance and said it was John Smith? Was it another human or was it a machine? So just make sure when you get those kind of answers that you're peeling away at the onion and saying, that's not enough. I want to know why was my client initially suspected. So let's imagine you now know you have a facial recognition case. That is when the hard part really starts. There's two barriers to challenging facial recognition. And the first is that police do not have to have probable cause to put someone in a lineup. I'm gonna say that again because I know we all know it and it's hard to lose, it's easy to lose sight of. The police do not need probable cause to put someone in a lineup. They can use all kinds of horrible techniques. They could go to psychics, they could use tarot cards, they could rely on their own gut feeling. None of those things would be good enough to make an arrest, but they are certainly good enough to put someone in an ID procedure. And I think we all know that, right? Because in our own practice, when we're challenging identification procedures, you could challenge the composition. You could say these fillers had absolutely no business being there. You could challenge the suggestibility. You could say, you shouldn't have said the things you said. The fillers shouldn't have been dressed the way they were. But as a defense attorney, there's really not a mechanism for us to say, my client shouldn't have been in the lineup in the first place. So that's something I think we really have to understand, because if you pick up one of these cases and you go in telling the court, well, this should be thrown out because the police didn't have probable cause to put my client in an ID procedure, facial recognition isn't good enough, you're dead in the water. That is not an argument that's gonna win anybody over. So the second barrier to challenging this stuff is that the law is really not very well designed to challenge forensics that neither party is trying to introduce at trial. So typically, whenever we're bringing a forensic challenge, depending on your jurisdiction, you're asking for either a Fry hearing or a Daubert hearing. And at that hearing, the court's essentially deciding, is this forensic junk science? And if it's junk science, if the court decides that, then the remedy is that the prosecution can't bring up anything about those forensics. But at least what we're seeing right now, which may change in the next few years, is that the prosecution is not trying to bring up facial recognition. So if you write a Daubert or a Fry motion and say, I need a hearing, I want to challenge the forensics, it's very likely the prosecution's going to respond and say, you know what, cool, we're not trying to bring up the fact that facial recognition was used at all, and your motion will be denied. So once we understand that those are the two barriers, we really have two jobs. And the first one is to pierce the identification. And here's what I mean by that. I really think of a positive identification as setting up a roadblock. You can challenge in court what happens during the identification, and you can challenge what happens after that. But when there's a positive ID, it is incredibly hard to convince a court to let you challenge what happened before. So we have to be creative and we have to be smart and think of ways to convince the court we should be able to challenge what's happening before the ID. And the second thing that we've got to do is we have to decide what remedy we want. Because at least for the next few years, it's very unlikely there's going to be forensic evidence for us to suppress. So we have to be asking for something else. So what kind of relief do we want? The first thing we want is discovery. Like Josh and Claire both talked about, we have a general idea of how this technology is working, but the truth is, we don't have a clue what algorithms the police are using. We don't know what the error rates are. We don't know what kind of training people are getting. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe we have that information in any jurisdiction anywhere yet. And we are gonna have a very hard time convincing the court that these things are unreliable if we can't figure out how it works. So we wanna be asking for discovery early and often in every case. And if you get it, please, please share it because we all want it so badly. The next thing that we wanna be doing are making Brady demands also early and often. So as my co-panelists also have already talked about, facial recognition doesn't just produce one candidate. It doesn't say this is the person. It produces an array of candidates. And then there's a human who's saying, that's the person. So Imagine if you had just a standard ID case and you learned that the eyewitness said, I'm positive it's one of these 6 people. I know it must be one of these 6. You would consider that exculpatory evidence. You'd go into court saying, you have to let me know who the other 5 are. And I think that we can think of facial recognition in this same way, and we're really, our best avenue is gonna be to use the language of Brady to demand this information. And we also wanna be demanding the confidence scores. So as Josh talked about, it is not true that the confidence scores lay on top of probabilities, right? So it's not a perfect analogy, but I think that you can argue to a court it's still somewhat similar to, right, a witness who says, I'm 70% sure that's the guy, right? We would all consider that is exculpatory because what that person is telling you is, I'm not positive. And while the confidence scores don't lay perfectly onto probabilities, what they're telling you is that the machine is saying, I'm not positive. There is an error rate here. And you want to know what that looks like. And I think that's another thing we want to really be asking for in our Brady demands. And then the last thing, this is really like the gold. This is what I think we really want, and it is the hardest thing to figure out how to get to, and that's suppression of the eyewitness identification. So there's 2 avenues that I think we can really use to try to get the ID suppressed. The first is that in some situations, I think we can make arguments in the suppression hearings that we're already doing. So I think in a limited number of cases, we can argue that the use of facial recognition is making the ID procedure more suggestive. So that would happen when the eyewitness is aware, either because they're told or because it's made obvious, that facial recognition already made a match. That happens. I'm litigating a facial recognition case right now where we sent out an investigator to talk to the eyewitness who said, oh yeah, the police told me this was that the facial recognition picked out this guy and wanted to know if it got it right. That happens. I firmly believe that there is no one on the planet who is more suspicious of eyewitnesses than police, right? They have all had cases where they are positive they had the right person, but for this eyewitness who picked somebody else and in their mind blew it up. So I think sometimes police do really surprising things to try to stack IDs whenever they believe they've got the right person. So when you're doing these hearings, I think you want to start building in questions about what information the eyewitness had prior to the ID. And if you've got the bandwidth, send an investigator out and try to talk to these eyewitnesses, because that really may be your best time to try and figure out what they knew. So that's one thing we can do, but that's going to apply to a very limited number of cases. So the other thing that we can do is invent a hearing, figure out what remedy we want, and ask for that. Every single hearing that we do as a standard hearing is something that some smart lawyer invented once, right? And the courts have incredibly broad latitude to make decisions about admissibility of evidence pre-trial, right? This is something new. The law hasn't quite caught up to the technology, and there's a lot of space for us to figure out how we want to challenge it. So what would a novel hearing look like? While we're thinking of what kind of hearing we want, one of the primary things we have to keep in mind is what remedy do we want? And I think in this situation, the remedy we really want to get to is suppression of the eyewitness ID. I think the argument that we really want to make is that we are requesting something that's Daubert or Frye-like, right? We want a hearing where we can challenge the scientific reliability of this forensic evidence, but the remedy we want is suppression of the eyewitness ID. I think our best chance really is to try to borrow some of the language from Daubert and Frye, because the standard is already there. You don't have to invent a new standard, and there is so much case law that we can tap into. So if we want to make that argument, the way we have to do it is to make the argument that the court should suppress the eyewitness identification because the use of facial recognition made the ID unreliable. That is a really tricky argument. So how do we make that? Well, I think what is fairly clear in the undercurrent of identification law, right, is that it's really not about fairness, it's about innocence. Courts really have a mandate to try to limit the incident of misidentification. That's really, I think, what's going on. So the way that courts do that most of the time is by trying to limit suggestiveness. And that makes perfect sense, because we all understand that if there's a really suggestive identification procedure, it's more likely that the eyewitness will get it wrong. It is theoretically possible, though, although I don't believe there's any court yet who has recognized this, that you could have a forensic procedure that made the eyewitness ID unreliable, even if it wasn't traditionally suggestive. And that's what I think is going on here. That's the argument that I hope will start to win hearts and minds eventually. That really these are unreliable IDs because of facial recognition. So why would that be? I think that is the case because of what I like to think of as the lookalike problem. So we have no reason to believe that strangers are any good at all at differentiating between the true perpetrator and someone who's been selected by a machine because they look just like the true perpetrator. It is presumably, if facial recognition is any good at all at selecting either the true perpetrator or someone who looks just like them, we'd expect that when somebody is put in an ID procedure that was selected from facial recognition, that you're going to get more positive IDs. But the question is, are we getting more true positives or more false positives? Right? In order to figure that out, what we need is a hearing. We really need to know, is this technology any good at all? Because if it's not any good, then you would anticipate that what's really happening is more misidentifications. That you have eyewitnesses who are saying, that's the guy, because he looks just like the guy. So I think that's the argument we want to make. And I think for those of you in jurisdictions, again, like New York, where single photo IDs are sometimes still done, even if they're not always admissible, I think your argument becomes even stronger, that this really is not independent evidence, it's just a confirmation of what facial recognition has already decided. Very briefly, I just want to touch on how you go about writing your motion. I think first, you want to make sure you're explaining this technology to the court. You are very unlikely, I think, to come across a judge who already deeply understands what's going on. You're probably not going to come across prosecutors right now who deeply understand how this works, so you have to have a section explaining it. I think a lot of people are likely to imagine this technology is better than it actually is. Also, you want to be really thoughtful about word choice. This stuff is so brand new. We really, as defense attorneys, have a moment to try to frame how people are thinking about it. I think you want to try to avoid words like match as much as possible and not give this stuff an air of scientific reliability that it actually doesn't have. And lastly, be really creative. As long as you are keeping in mind the two barriers that we talked about before, that you can't challenge this just based on a lack of probable cause to put your client in ID procedure. That's not going to work. And you can't go into these cases just asking for a Fryer-Daubert hearing. As long as you're keeping those two things in mind, there is so much space to be creative. So I think I'll hand this back to Claire to wrap us up.
Just before I continue, just to underscore two things that Kaitlin said. Discovery, critically important. What we're seeing is a trend in New York where we've had the most discovery motions around face recognition submitted. In 3 of the 5 cases that I know about, the case was pled out or dropped entirely, rather than the prosecution responding to a motion requesting information about face recognition. And then in terms of Brady, I was talking about the candidate list. NYPD it has intentionally chosen 250 as the length of their candidate list because they think they would rather look through 250 photos than miss if their face recognition system made a match at person 249. So if you're thinking about Brady, that means the system, if your client was 249, it means the system thought that 248 people looked more like the suspect, more like the person in the probe photo. And in New York alone, there have been over 3,000 arrests made with face recognition as a component of the NYPD's case. So this does show up in cases, even if it doesn't show up on paper or in discovery. So I do want to leave time for questions, but I'd be remiss if I didn't end by scaring the crap out of everybody about where this technology is going and where it already is. What is the future of face recognition? We see companies pushing incredibly aggressively to get face recognition on live feed body cameras, meaning that the body camera feed is actually being running against, let's say, a watch list of people with outstanding arrest warrants as the officer is just walking in the field. Why is this so scary? What it means is that the officer gets an alert, maybe on his phone or maybe in a headset, saying, the person we just passed, there's an 80% confidence, or a 0.87 confidence, whatever that means, that the person you just passed is considered armed and dangerous. A reasonable officer, what is a reasonable officer going to do with that information, except consider it a public safety emergency and potentially draw his weapon or use lethal force? So what we'd have is a situation where the final arbiter of flawed technology is an officer with a gun in a real-world, high-stress scenario. Talked a little bit about real-time surveillance and face surveillance technology. This is coming, as I mentioned. The White House is now trialing it. Orlando's trialing it. We have reason to believe there are other systems out there as well. Stay tuned. We're still trying to confirm those. This is scanning the face of everybody walking by. In terms of accuracy, the accuracy is going to tank the lower the quality of the probe photo is, which means that surveillance footage capturing tons and tons of faces probably not going to be highly accurate. And then there's Faceception. Faceception is a real company based in Israel, but they claim to have at least 2 contracts with defense agencies or homeland security agencies in the world. They purport to be able to predict somebody's propensity to commit certain types of crime, such as pedophilia or terrorism, based on people's facial characteristics. Yes, this is physiognomy by algorithm. Yes, there is no science behind this. The Wall Street Journal recently did an expose where they talked to the CEO of this company, asked him, what is the science behind this? The guy was like, there is no science behind this. If you look at their promotional materials, it's quite simply racism by algorithm. That exists today, and there are no practical checks in terms of laws protecting us against these systems being used. Scary stuff. Let's take questions. Yeah, if the video, the capture of the probe footage or photos can fall under that, then you can definitely make that argument. Generally speaking, what we've seen is law enforcement say it's axiomatic that we can take videography in public or photography in public. So if your face shows up, you have no expectation of privacy to that.
I'll speak up as a non-lawyer and say something that may be completely stupid, in which case I expect these two to sort of tackle my microphone away from me. Which is there's this Kylo standard that comes out of a case involving thermal imagers, which turns on the sort of general availability of the technology, whether it's only available to police or whether it's more generally available. And I think that might be hard to apply given that these technologies are pretty widely available. You know, anyone can go buy top flight face recognition from Amazon for pretty cheap per photo. But I think it might be interesting to look at the arguments made in that case and how they would apply and how that would differ from, you know, just normal curtilage versus photography in public kinds of arguments.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think my suspicion is that before any of us get discovery, right, we're gonna we're gonna have to get a court order. So I was telling Claire before, when I was sitting in the back during one of the panels this morning, the prosecutor in my facial recognition case sent me a handful of texts and said, I'm trying to get all these other photos. The NYPD will not give me any of the photos of the other people that the facial recognition picked up, which is interesting because it's such a lovely, rare thing when you get a prosecutor who's not stonewalling, but he's getting stonewalled by the NYPD. And I think that for a lot of this facial recognition, it is the police as much, if not more, than prosecutors that are being so protective of this. So I think all of that's true, and I think no one's gonna get it until we start getting subpoenas and court orders, probably.
Right. The New York County defenders have said that they're going to ask for it in every single case. They're going to make the prosecutor say it wasn't used, as opposed to trying to find out whether it was used or not. We are out of time. I'm certainly going to be around. I don't know if my co-panelists are.
Yeah.
More than happy to entertain questions now or via email.